Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep into the world of the CompTIA A+2 2011-02 exam, and this time we're tackling a big one, operating systems. This is part one of our four-part series, so buckle up.
That's right, operating systems, the unsung heroes of the tech world. Whether you're troubleshooting a computer or building a career in IT, knowing how they work is essential.
Absolutely. So where do we even begin? What's the first thing someone studying for this exam needs to know about operating systems?
Well, before we get into the weeds, it all starts with the basics. Installation and configuration. Think of it like building a house. You need a solid foundation before you can do anything else.
Makes sense. So knowing how to do a clean install of Windows, for example, or setting up user accounts, that's crucial.
Exactly. And it's not just about getting the operating system up and running, it's about understanding network settings, drivers, the boot process, all those things the exam might ask about.
Right, like that question that gets everyone. A user's network printer isn't working after a fresh Windows install. What are your first troubleshooting steps? You need to know where to even look.
Exactly. And here's another curveball the exam might throw at you. Image deployment. It's basically installing the same operating system image on multiple computers, a huge time saver in a business setting.
Wow, imagine setting up a whole office with new computers that way. No more installing each program individually. Are there any other time-saving tricks related to operating systems that we need to know for the exam?
Absolutely. Don't forget about built-in utilities and tools. They're like the Swiss Army knives of operating systems. Disk cleanup, activity monitor, all those things that help troubleshoot problems and keep things running smoothly.
Right, like essential maintenance
Yeah.
tools. But it's not enough to just know how to use them, right? The exam probably goes deeper into how the operating system actually works.
You got it. The exam will definitely test your knowledge of concepts like kernels, processes, threads, the heart and soul of the operating system.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. Can you break down what a kernel is for those of us who aren't exactly programmers?
Think of the kernel as the boss, the heart of the operating system. It talks directly to the hardware, managing memory, processing power, input-output operations. It's like the conductor of an orchestra, making sure everything plays together in harmony.
So the kernel's the boss. What about processes and threads? Where do they fit in this orchestra analogy?
Processes are like the individual musicians, each representing a running program. Threads are like the different notes or parts of the music. They play smaller tasks within a process.
So multitasking is like the whole orchestra playing a complex symphony with the kernel conducting it all.
Precisely. The exam might ask you to differentiate between those, like what's the difference between a process and a thread? Or how does the kernel manage system resources? It's all connected.
This is making a lot more sense now. But with all these processes and threads going on, managing memory must be a nightmare.
That's where memory management comes in. The operating system is like a librarian, allocating and deallocating memory to different processes, making sure everything has enough space to run. We'll dive deeper into this, especially virtual memory, in a later episode.
It's amazing how the operating system does all this behind the scenes to keep things running smoothly.
It really is. And unfortunately, just like with any complex system, sometimes things go wrong, hence the importance of understanding common errors.
Oh, you mean like the dreaded blue screen of death in Windows? Talk about a tech nightmare.
Exactly. The exam might throw error messages at you and ask you to identify the problem and how to fix it. Think of it as your IT first aid kit. Knowing how to deal with those errors can save you a lot of trouble in the real world.
It's like being a computer detective, looking for clues to solve the mystery of a crashing program or a frozen screen. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of operating systems for the CompTIA +2 2011-02 exam. Last time we were talking about those error messages, those cryptic messages like the blue screen of death that can really stump you.
Oh yeah, those error messages, they're definitely not user-friendly. But the exam expects you to go beyond just recognizing them. You need to understand what they mean, why they happen, and most importantly, how to fix them. It's like being a detective.
So it's not enough to just say, oh, it's a blue screen. We need to be able to explain the underlying cause and the steps to resolve it, like what might cause a blue screen, for example.
Exactly. It could be anything from faulty hardware to driver conflicts, even corrupt system files. And the exam might hit you with a scenario like a user's computer is stuck in a boot loop. What do? You need to know how to troubleshoot that. And that means understanding the boot process inside and out.
Ah, the boot process. From the moment you hit the power button to the operating system loading up. That whole sequence is crucial.
Absolutely. Knowing your BIOS from your UEFI, understanding how the operating system kernel loads, that's all fair game for the exam. And speaking of things that can go wrong, let's talk about malware.
Ooh, yeah. Malware, viruses, worms, ransomware, all those nasty digital critters lurking out there. Does the exam go deep into cybersecurity?
Well, it's not a full-blown cybersecurity deep dive, but you definitely need to be aware of common threats and how to prevent them. Think basic security hygiene, strong passwords, keeping your software updated, recognizing phishing attempts, those sorts of
So
things.
knowing how to spot a potential malware infection
Yeah.
and understanding basic security best practices is a must. Like if your computer suddenly starts running slow or you get bombarded with pop-ups, that's a red flag, right?
Absolutely. And don't forget about firewalls. They're your first line of defense against unauthorized access. The exam might ask you about configuring software firewalls in Windows or understanding the basics of hardware firewalls.
Right, those digital gatekeepers that control network access. So a solid grasp of operating systems also means knowing how to keep them secure. Let's switch gears for a bit and talk about file systems. What's the deal with those?
Ah, file systems. Think of them as the organizers of your computer. They determine how data is stored and retrieved on your hard drive. The exam focuses on understanding different file systems like FAT32, NTFS, and XFAT, each with its own quirks and limitations.
So knowing which file system to use for a particular task is key. Like you wouldn't use FAT32 for a large external hard drive because of that pesky 4 GB file size limit.
Exactly. NTFS would be a better choice in that scenario, with its larger file size support and better security features. The exam might ask you to compare and contrast file systems or even troubleshoot common file system errors.
It's all about choosing the right tool for the job. Speaking of different tools, the world of operating systems isn't limited to just Windows, right?
Hmm.
What about Mac OS and Linux?
You're right, it's a diverse world out there. While the CompTIA A+ exam primarily focuses on Windows, you do need a basic understanding of other operating systems like Mac OS and Linux. Think of it as being multilingual in the tech world.
So knowing the difference between a .dmg file on a Mac and a .exe file on Windows, or being able to navigate a Linux terminal that could come in handy.
Absolutely. The exam might test you on recognizing those key differences between operating systems and their common use cases.
It's like being a digital diplomat, able to navigate different technological landscapes. But let's zoom back in on the inner workings of operating systems. We talked about kernels before, but what about operating system architectures?
Ah, yes, architectures. It's about understanding the blueprint, the fundamental structure of an operating system. The exam might ask you about monolithic kernels versus microkernels, which is basically like comparing a skyscraper with all its systems interconnected to a network of smaller, specialized buildings.
So understanding these different architectures helps us grasp the strengths and weaknesses of various operating systems. That's pretty cool. But operating systems don't just exist in isolation these days, do they? We live in a connected world.
Exactly. The exam also covers how operating systems function in a networked environment. This means understanding network protocols like TCP/IP, knowing the difference between a static and dynamic IP address, and being familiar with client-server architecture, among other things.
So it's like learning the language of networks, how data travels between computers, how devices are identified, all that good stuff. And of course, we can't forget about security in a networked environment.
Absolutely. Firewalls are important, but so are things like strong passwords, two-factor authentication, and knowing how to secure remote access to your systems.
Speaking of remote access, it seems like everyone's working remotely these days. Does the exam go into detail about specific remote access tools?
It doesn't get into the specifics of any particular software, but it does cover the fundamentals of remote access protocols like RDP for Windows and SSH for Linux, and of course the security considerations that come with enabling remote access.
So understanding these different remote access methods and their security implications is key. It's like having a secure tunnel into your computer from anywhere in the world. But all this talk about networks and remote access reminds me we can't forget about command line interfaces.
Ah, yes, the command line. While most users are comfortable with graphical interfaces these days, the command line still holds immense power and flexibility, especially for tasks like system administration or troubleshooting.
It's like having a secret backdoor to your operating system, right?
Exactly. And the exam tests your ability to navigate that backdoor effectively, particularly in a Windows environment. Knowing basic commands like dir to list directory contents or copy to duplicate files is essential.
And don't forget about commands like ping for testing network connectivity. It's like having a whole secret language to communicate with your computer.
Exactly. The more fluent you are in that language, the better equipped you'll be to manage your systems effectively. And speaking of efficiency, we can't forget about one of the biggest time savers in the IT world, scripting and automation.
Yes, automation. It's like having your computer do your work for you, right? But seriously, how does scripting and automation tie into the CompTIA A+ exam?
Well, the exam recognizes the importance of automation in today's IT world and includes questions related to basic scripting concepts, primarily in a Windows environment using batch files or PowerShell.
So knowing how to write a simple batch script or understanding PowerShell syntax could give us an edge.
Absolutely. Imagine having to create hundreds of user accounts with specific settings. Doing that manually would take forever. But with a script, you can automate the entire process in minutes.
That's incredible. So scripting is all about working smarter, not harder. It's like having a team of digital assistants at your beck and call.
Exactly. And the more you understand about scripting and automation, the more you'll be able to streamline your workflow and free up your time for more complex tasks.
Welcome back to the final stretch of our deep dive into operating systems for the CompTIA A+ 220 1102 exam. We've covered a lot of ground, from the inner workings of kernels to the power of automation.
It's been quite a journey, but we're not done yet. There's one more crucial aspect we need to cover: performance tuning.
Ah, yes, performance tuning. Because who wants a sluggish computer?
Yeah.
So we're talking about making those operating systems run as smoothly and efficiently as possible, right?
Exactly. And this is important not just for the exam, but for real-world scenarios, too. Users expect their systems to be responsive, and knowing how to optimize performance is key.
So it's not just about having the fastest hardware. It's about fine-tuning the operating system itself.
Precisely. It's about going beyond the basic upgrades and really digging into the settings, resource management, identifying bottlenecks. Think of it like tuning a high-performance engine. You need to make sure everything is working in perfect harmony.
Okay, I like that analogy. What are some things someone might need to know for the exam when it comes to performance tuning?
Well, they could be presented with scenarios involving slow boot times, applications lagging, that kind of thing. They might need to understand how to analyze system logs, use performance monitoring tools, or tweak system settings.
It sounds like they really need to know their way around the operating system to diagnose and fix those performance issues.
Absolutely. They might even get a question like, a user complains about slow boot times in Windows. What are some potential causes and solutions? That requires knowing about startup programs, hard drive optimization, even potential hardware issues.
So it's not just about knowing the operating system, it's about being a bit of a detective too.
Exactly. And speaking of bigger picture thinking, let's not forget about how operating systems work in a networked environment.
Right, because most computers these days aren't just sitting alone in a room. They're connected to networks, sharing resources, talking to each other.
And the exam dives into that. You'll need to understand network protocols like TCP/IP, be familiar with network configurations, and grasp concepts like client-server architecture.
So knowing how to configure a network printer, for example, or understanding the difference between a static and dynamic IP address, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And of course, security in a networked environment is paramount. We touched on firewalls earlier, but strong passwords, two-factor authentication, and securing remote access are all crucial.
Speaking of remote access, it's practically everywhere these days. Does the exam get into the nitty-gritty of specific remote access tools?
It doesn't focus on any particular software, but it does cover the fundamentals of remote access protocols like RDP for Windows and SSH for Linux, as well as the security considerations.
Right, because anytime you're connecting to your computer remotely, you want to make sure it's secure.
Well, it seems like we've covered just about everything under the sun when it comes to operating systems for the CompTIA A+ 220 1102 exam.
We've definitely gone deep. From the core components to the complexities of networking and beyond, a solid understanding of operating systems is essential for anyone pursuing a career in IT.
It's like we've unlocked the secrets of the digital world. So to all our listeners out there, embrace the challenge, keep those brains engaged, and never stop exploring the fascinating world of operating systems.